Good evening. My name is Ilya. My opponent is Rav Reuven. We will be recording interesting questions that imply various interesting answers. That's it. Not always comfortable, but always interesting. So today we have a rather unusual question. Well, those of us who live in Israel encounter this less often. Those who live in Jerusalem, even less so. And those in Mea Shearim probably almost never encounter it at all. But Jews are scattered all over the world, and we constantly see some symbols, that is, symbols of another faith, in different places. Sometimes they are directly connected to the promotion of another religion, and sometimes they're just random things. And so, reading your groups, I saw questions like, is it allowed to keep coins with crosses on them? Or do you need to file off the crosses from your ears? Could you please talk a little about this topic? For example, the cross, which is basically a symbol of Christianity, and which we encounter in our lives, sometimes directly symbolizing the religion, sometimes indirectly, or sometimes not related at all. How should a Jew act in these situations? What does the Torah say? And what would you advise? Please share your opinion.
Yes, this is, of course, an important and interesting question. And maybe many people will think, as you said, that those who live in Israel encounter this all the time, especially in Jerusalem. So I wanted to make a small note that it's interesting that in Jerusalem in particular, especially in the Old City, there is actually a lot of Christianity present. And when you walk through the Arab market, for example, it's the Arabs who are selling there. They don't have any. There's no problem with Christianity for them. They believe that Jesus is one of the prophets. So they sell all these Christian items as well. Islam, in principle, is not considered idolatry, but they also sell various Christian crosses and so on, and also various icons. And as I was walking through these places, I actually had a question come up. A question from the perspective of action, because we have a law about this. Of course, it's clear that I never intended to buy any of these things. But here's the question. If someone buys something there, there's a law that avodah zarah, idolatry. If you buy it, then the money. Not only is idolatry itself forbidden, but also the money given in exchange is forbidden as well. So it turns out that if I buy something permitted at that kiosk and they give me change, I have no idea where that money came from. Maybe that money comes from the purchase of some icons, and that money is forbidden. That's why even in Jerusalem, and maybe especially in Jerusalem, these kinds of questions can come up. But of course, I think many people don't really understand what this is about or what exactly is forbidden. And of course, this is a big topic. So, what I can say will be brief. The Torah, as we see, the main prohibition, the one the Torah talks about constantly, and not just in the 5 books of Moses, but also throughout the other books of the Tanakh, the Hebrew Bible, speaks extensively about this prohibition, the prohibition of idolatry. Since Christians also worship, not only do they worship, they have a supreme God, right? Well, they have what they call the Son, and they have the Trinity. And that's where the problem arises. The problem is that this is considered idolatry. And that's why this is one of the most serious prohibitions, both for Jews and for non-Jews. There is a law that says if a person believes that an idol, that is, the object itself that they worship, possesses some kind of divine powers, and they worship it as a representative, perhaps, of God. In other words, if they worship that specific thing, then that very object is forbidden. It is forbidden to derive any pleasure from it. But when it comes to the cross, a question arises. When a Christian worships the cross, what does he actually mean? Does he believe that the cross itself possesses some kind of power, that he is deifying the cross itself? Or does he see it as just a sign, a symbol of some higher power? If he worships the cross itself, if he believes that the cross itself is like his idol, then that cross is forbidden. It is forbidden to derive any pleasure from it. Moreover, it is forbidden for a Jew to own it. This could happen, for example, if a Jew rents out an apartment to someone. Right. He rents out the apartment, a non-Jew moves in, and brings his idols with him. And since this apartment is mine, and a Jew is forbidden to have any idolatrous objects in his possession, he has a problem. So, from a halakhic perspective, what is actually the law? When it comes to the cross, there is a lot of uncertainty, because it's not entirely clear what they mean by it. One of our rabbis, a rabbi, told me that he met a Christian priest when he was on his way to South Africa, and he approached him and asked, "What do you mean by this? Do you mean that it is itself divine, or is it just a symbol of some kind?" Basically, the priest didn't even understand the question, which just adds to the uncertainty. So they weren't able to clarify it. But in any case, the great poskim, the leading halakhic authorities, already write that if it's a cross worn for decorative purposes, for example, as a necklace, then without a doubt, that is not considered actual idolatry. And so, there's really no problem if someone comes into my property wearing such a cross, or if someone bought such a cross to enjoy it, or if, for some reason, a Jew ends up with a gold cross, he can sell it. In other words, a cross that's just for decoration is not an issue. I don't remember if I've covered the topic you brought up completely, but I hope that.
I'll ask something else in a moment. But actually, we remember where this law, this commandment, comes from. That is, when the Jews left Egypt, there was that first instance of idolatry, after which, as we know, there's the whole story. Moses came down, saw the golden idol, and his reaction. Thank you. But what you're saying is absolutely clear. Jews are forbidden from practicing idolatry. Jews have one God whom they believe in. But we're surrounded by all sorts of symbols from other religions and faiths. Sometimes we know about them, sometimes we don't. Some people worship elephants. Zoroastrians worship fire. That doesn't mean I can't look at a campfire, right? Throughout human history, there have been so many different religious and non-religious movements, and all kinds of worship. We definitely can know all these symbols, all this symbolism, and be sure that we haven't brought some symbol into our home that someone out there worships. To give a simple example again, fire is a symbol that many religions have worshipped. But that's what other people do. Jews worship their own God. Here's the question. If for a Jew, fire is just fire, But for someone else, it's a divine entity. But for a Jew, that's not the case. Can he light a fire, look at the flame, cook over that fire?
That's a great question. It really is necessary here to explain more clearly what we're talking about, what an idol actually is. Basically, you need to understand that an idol is not just some concept. That's the first thing. Because fire isn't an object, an idol has to be a specific object. And again, an idol is also not just a symbol of some religion. It's a specific object that people worship. That's the first point. The second point is the land and things attached to the land, like a house. Well, regarding a house, there's actually some debate about that in the Gemara. I'm not going to use that example because a house, after all, was built, right? In other words, it was attached to the land. But if it's something that has always existed, like a rock or a mountain, then those things are not going to be prohibited. Animals also won't be prohibited if someone worships them. There are people who worship the sun. So what now? Does that mean it's forbidden to benefit from the sun? All these things, stars, the earth, animals, these things will not be prohibited. Now, there's another thing. Here's an interesting question I received. In Spain, there's a monument to Rambam. So the local students, non-Jews, have a custom that in order to get a good grade on an exam, they need to polish the shoes of this monument. Many students go and polish the shoes of the Rambam monument. The question is this monument considered forbidden or not? Is it an idol or is it not an idol? Why am I using this example? Because I think with this example, we can understand a little better what we're talking about. So, what's the answer to this question? First of all, we need to understand why people are doing this. There's something called a segula in Hebrew. A segula is an action where you don't really know how it works. For example, like the belief that if you sit at the corner of a table, you'll never get married. That's one of them. A person doesn't know how it's connected to spiritual forces, but it's just a superstition. Other people have something positive, some kind of good omen. If a person, for example, just believes in a superstition like polishing their shoes will bring them luck on an exam, there's nothing wrong with that. I mean, there might be an issue with the superstitions themselves, but from the perspective of idolatry, it has nothing to do with the laws of idolatry. But if a person believes that Rambam is some kind of power and that he needs to serve this power by polishing its shoes, then that is forbidden. Basically, if that's the case, no one is planning to buy a monument. But what could be the problem? If it's hot and there's shade from the monument, then if this monument is considered idolatry, it would be forbidden to benefit from the shade of the monument. But the answer to this question is as follows. Regardless of whether this monument is considered, whether these actions are done as a form of worship to the monument, or people are just doing it, as a segula, as some kind of omen, it doesn't matter. This monument will not be forbidden. And why? Because it doesn't belong to them. We have a rule. If something doesn't belong to a person, like yes, you ask, how can we know if I'm walking down the street and someone comes up to me and I have a suitcase with $1 million in it? Someone comes up and starts worshiping this suitcase. So what? Should I throw everything away? No. There's a rule. A person cannot forbid something that doesn't belong to them. That's an additional rule. Besides that, if someone did something, we know it's idolatry, but then he threw away the idol, meaning he nullified it. This is an interesting law. A non-Jew can nullify his own idol, and then it can be used. But if a Jew nullifies it, even then, it will be forbidden forever.
Well, the circle is getting smaller. And if we go back to the monument, if it's a beautiful monument and I admire it, is that okay? Does that break any laws?
Basically, if we're admiring the monument itself as a work of art, then there's no problem with that. At least from the perspective of idolatry.
And if the sculptor is Jewish, can he create such art in the form of a monument?
There are additional prohibitions which aren't directly related. Well, they could be connected in some way to idolatry. But for Jews, there is a prohibition against making three-dimensional statues of a person. Yes, there are questions: is the whole body prohibited or the head too? Only the head is also prohibited to make. But this is a separate prohibition, which really prohibits. Moreover, it is interesting what is prohibited. It is only prohibited to make a three-dimensional human. But as for drawing a sculpture, there is no problem. And there are things like,
is it allowed to make images of people?
It's allowed to draw images of people. It's only forbidden to make a sculpture. But there are things that are basically forbidden. It's also forbidden to draw them because of how they look. In general, a Jew is not allowed to draw a complete sun, stars, and so on. But that's already. Maybe we shouldn't get sidetracked. That's an additional prohibition. If a Jew made such a monument, for example, at Ben Gurion Airport, there's a statue of Ben Gurion's head, right? So there's no problem enjoying it or being in its shade since, well, there's no sun there, basically, right? That's because it's inside a building. But if it were outside, if someone made a monument, even though it's forbidden for a Jew to make a statue, there's no prohibition against deriving benefit from it, since it's not considered an idol.
So, can we say that if there are certain household items, or in the house, or we come across symbols somewhere that, not ones that directly copy someone's religious symbols, but ones that don't carry that idea or motive and have never been objects of worship, but just happen to be used as a pattern, ornament, or as a decorative element on a chessboard, then we can accept them without concern. It's not necessary to make any changes or throw away, say, coins with a cross symbol, or, for example, to cut off the little cross on top of the king or queen on a chessboard, or to paint over a tablecloth that has a crescent moon pattern, or to cross out the crescent moon symbol on the air conditioner that shows the time, and so on. All of that is unnecessary. You can calmly understand that these symbols have nothing to do with any religious dogmas. They just happen to coincide, and you can live with them peacefully. They don't cause any problems with our traditions.
If we're just talking about things that, as you said, are just a coincidence. For example, the Chevrolet symbol. Yes, they have a cross like that. But I don't think it has anything to do with Christianity at all, so obviously there's no issue with that. But I'd like to broaden the question. If it really is a symbol of some religion, for example, the crescent or the Christian cross, like the symbol of Switzerland, then yes, undoubtedly, that's a symbol of Christianity or a symbol of Islam. But from the strict legal perspective, even if it truly is a symbol of some religion, since people don't actually worship the symbol itself, from the standpoint of the strict law, there's no problem with it. But of course, since a person wants to distance themselves from all of this, as much as possible, they should try to get rid of it, so that it's not noticeable, so that it's not in everyone's sight. Let me give you an interesting example. There was a girl from Moscow who wanted to rent an apartment with some other girls, and she found one. That is, it's very difficult, because usually there are also young men and so on. And it was very hard for her to find an apartment. She found one apartment, and in her room there was an icon. The owner of the apartment told her that he would rent it out only on the condition that the icon stays in its place and is not touched. So she asked me, "Is it allowed to rent this apartment, this room?" I told her that since we have a prohibition against a Jew owning any idols, and people do worship icons, what she should do is simply say that she is renting the whole room except for that wall, and anything next to that wall. That's the first thing. And secondly, I advised her to cover the icon with something. This isn't strictly from a legal standpoint, but I think that a Jew who has an icon hanging on the wall wouldn't feel comfortable living in such a house.
I see. Well, I think we managed to clear up a lot of different doubts and questions that people had. We even made everyday life easier for some people. There you go. And now, not a single chess king will suffer anymore. Thank you very much. I think it was really interesting.
Thank you, Ilya, for your interesting question. I just want to finish with what's written in the book of Mishlei, the book of Proverbs. Give to the wise, and he will become even wiser. This topic, of course, the topic of idolatry, and idolatry even in our days, is, as I said, a very broad one. And of course, it's impossible to cover it all in just a few minutes. But I think that, thanks to your questions, what we were able to do is raise some issues that will spark even more reflection and more questions. This will give a person, tenli chacham, as it is said, give a wise person some ground to work with, and it will allow him to continue developing this wisdom and to understand more and more deeply.
Well, if there's interest, we can expand on this topic and ask some more interesting questions.
With God's help. All right. Thank you. All the best.
Goodbye.